2.600 years ago, on the beautiful island of Corfu, there existed a temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis. This ancient structure was not just a place of worship, but also a silent keeper of a myth that has lived on for centuries, a myth centered around the figure of Medusa. You might be familiar with her, a terrifying monster with snakes for hair and a gaze that could turn anyone to stone. But do you truly know her story? Do you understand the complexity, the tragedy, and the profound intricacies that define her existence? Come with me, as we delve into the real story of Medusa. Let's go back to the very beginning. The first literary account of Medusa comes to us courtesy of the poet Hesiod. In his writings, the Gorgons, 3 sisters, dwell beyond the glorious ocean. In a land that borders the night, 2 of the sisters, Steno and Euryale, are immortal, ageless, and eternal, while the third, Medusa, suffers an unfortunate and tragic fate. It is in this setting, on the stunning island of Corfu, where the true story of Medusa begins. A tale, mind you, that has been carved in stone. Quite literally, over a century ago, farmers were working the land near the convent of Ioannis Theodorus in Corfu when they stumbled upon something unexpected: stone figures buried in the earth. At first, they didn't understand the significance of their discovery, but the Greek Archaeological Society soon arrived to unearth what would become a key archaeological find. Slowly, piece by piece, they revealed the remnants of an ancient temple dedicated to Artemis, built some 2.600 years ago. The scale of the temple was immense, but what truly amazed them was what they found within: a massive sculpted pediment. As the excavation continued, one of the most striking and fascinating discoveries emerged, right before the eyes of the German Kaiser himself: the face of a Gorgon. I've come here to meet this Gorgon, this Medusa, in the magnificent archaeological museum of Corfu. Here, we stand before the temple's pediment, which was discovered by those very farmers, and gaze upon the remarkable figure of Medusa. Unlike the typical, fearsome depictions, this Medusa is portrayed as a powerful and stunning being. Unlike the later depictions where she's often shown with snakes for hair, this Medusa's snakes are subtly intertwined with her hair, emerging from her locks like dangerous tendrils of power. The intricacy of her design is astounding, from the fine details in her hairline to the elegant, double snakes that form a belt around her waist, enhancing her fierce and powerful aura. Medusa is not simply a monster here, she is strong, formidable, and bold. Her wings, so often forgotten in later retellings, are present here, visible as delicate feathers just behind her left arm. This is a Gorgon with incredible strength, not the fragile, helpless creature of modern myth. Just take a look at her muscular arms, the powerful biceps that bulge from her well-defined frame. Medusa is a force to be reckoned with. Her muscular legs, clearly built for speed and flight, reveal the power that lies beneath her terrifying appearance. Those pinwheeling legs, a hallmark of ancient art, show her in motion. Perhaps running, but more likely flying. This dynamic portrayal speaks to her immense speed, her ability to traverse the heavens with wings that defy the earth-bound constraints of mere mortals. But even before Hesiod's account of Medusa in the 7th century BCE, Gorgons had already made appearances in ancient texts. They were present in Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, often portrayed as dark, mysterious figures associated with death and terror. Yet, the Medusa of Corfu, carved 2.600 years ago, takes us beyond the mere head of the Gorgon. She is an embodiment of the entire myth, complete with her body, her power, and her terrifying legacy. Gorgons were known for their wide mouths, their protruding tongues, and the cacophony of noise they could produce. Ancient authors were unnerved by the thought of women who could make such loud, fearsome sounds. Perhaps it was the noise of thunder that echoed from their very beings. The word, Gorgon, itself may have derived from the word for this thunderous noise. Gorgons were not just terrifying in their appearance but in the fearsome sound they could summon, a trait that may explain why they were feared so deeply by the ancient world. Medusa, the mortal among the Gorgon sisters, was the daughter of the primordial sea god for seas and his wife Ceto. While her sisters Steno and Euryale were immortal, Medusa was not so fortunate. Yet, what makes this depiction of Medusa so compelling is the story of her offspring. Most myths tell of the monsters that emerge from Medusa's severed head. But in this case, we see her in full form, alive, intact, and complete, and from her body emerge two of the most famous figures in Greek mythology, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden giant. These figures, depicted on the sculpture, are startlingly intricate. You can see Pegasus' winged body and tail, and just beside him, Chrysaor's giant form, with his foot nearly touching Medusa's own massive foot. Despite his size, he is dwarfed by her. Medusa's power is undeniable. The detail on this sculpture is breathtaking, from the intricate patterns on her skirt to the delicate plant motifs on her sandals. Medusa is portrayed not just as a monster, but as a beautiful, powerful protector. Her belt, made of snakes, is meticulously detailed, each scale of the snakes finely carved into the stone. This is a Medusa who serves a purpose beyond terror. She is a guardian, a protector of the temple of Artemis. Medusa's role as protector is an essential aspect of her character in this sculpture. Far from simply terrifying those who come near, Medusa is a guardian, a being who both protects and scares, depending on the perspective of the onlooker. Her protectiveness is underscored by the presence of the wild beasts that accompany her. One of these beasts is a leop panther, a mythical creature that is part lion and part panther, and it stands as a testament to Medusa's role as a fierce protector. The scale and beauty of this sculpture are astonishing. The Temple of Artemis, built in 580 BCE, was one of the earliest examples of Greek stone architecture. It was a massive building, a symbol of wealth and power, a statement to all who entered Corfu. The Gorgon's face, carved into the western pediment of the temple, would have loomed over anyone arriving by sea, immediately impressing upon them the grandeur of the city. It's hard to imagine what Corfu must have looked like during the 6th century BCE. But thanks to the work of local archaeologists like Eleni Shagu, we can picture it more vividly. The Temple of Artemis was an enormous structure, one of the first in Greece to be constructed almost entirely out of stone. Its scale was impressive, and it spoke to the power and prosperity of Corfu at the time. The Gorgon pediment, placed strategically above the entrance, was not only a symbol of protection but also a grand display of the city's wealth and influence. The altar within the temple was equally impressive, massive in scale, and strategically placed to serve as the heart of the temple. Even though the temple may not stand in its full grandeur today, the story of Medusa's role within it remains one of power, beauty, and mystery, forever captured in stone. Got it? Let me now proceed with rewriting the entire passage according to your start instructions. Here's the expanded, more detailed version. Blank. Blank. The cult of Artemis had a powerful presence, especially around the grand altar where rituals were performed. It wasn't a mere altar, it needed to be vast, enormous, as it demanded numerous sacrifices, mostly animals, and as uncomfortable as it may be for me to admit, being someone who values vegetarian principles, Artemis, in her ancient worship, required the blood of these creatures. She wasn't a goddess concerned with agriculture or domestic life. Like Demeter, no, Artemis ruled over the wild, the untouched, the mysterious. She was a being connected to the dense, untamed forests, the deep, shadowy woods, and the places where humans dared not tread. These were her sacred domains. She was known as Potnia Theron, the queen of wild creatures, and her power reigned over every creature that roamed these wildernesses. Artemis was a goddess who embodied the rawness of nature, both its beauty and its danger. It's no surprise, then, that Medusa and her wild companions were carved above the entrance of her temple in Corfu. Medusa, with her serpentine hair and monstrous form, symbolized the very spirit of Artemis' wild and unpredictable world. She was not a simple mythological figure but a protector of the land that Artemis governed. In a way, Medusa herself became a guardian of the untamed, the one who stood watch over the sacred temple dedicated to Artemis. Her beasts, leopards, panthers, creatures of the wild, stood with her, a reminder of the untouchable realm that Artemis watched over. These creatures were not mere ornamentation, they were part of a larger message. Artemis' domain was powerful, and it was guarded by fierce protectors. As we observe the Gorgon pediment in Corfu, we are reminded of the deep connection between Artemis and the wild world. There, Medusa stands, flanked by her fierce companions, the leopards, who act as both protectors and symbols of the unyielding force of nature. The Gorgons, monstrous as they were, served a vital role, guardians of the border between civilization and the wilderness. This image was not one of simple menace but of the necessary balance between the two forces. Medusa's gaze, turning all who met her into stone, was a form of protection, a warning to those who dared approach Artemis' sacred lands uninvited. The Gorgons were not just frightening creatures, they were essential in ensuring that the raw power of nature was both revered and respected. In the figurines left by worshippers, Artemis is often depicted as both nurturing and fierce. One of the most striking representations is of her holding a deer, a creature often associated with gentleness and beauty. The deer nuzzles close to her, trusting her completely. Yet, despite this tenderness, Artemis is always armed, her bow and arrow in hand, ready to hunt. This dual nature of Artemis, the protector of life, yet also the enforcer of balance, is captured perfectly in these offerings. The figurines were not just representations of Artemis, they were tokens, gifts, and pleas for her favor, meant to honor her power and ask for her protection. Her bow signifies not just a tool for hunting, but a symbol of her strength and readiness to defend the natural order. Artemis, as one of the three virgin goddesses of Mount Olympus, embodies a purity that is both powerful and dangerous. Alongside Athena and Hestia, she remains untouched by the world of men. As the daughter of Zeus and the sister to Apollo, she holds a unique position among the gods. Artemis is the guardian of young girls, guiding them through the innocence of childhood. Yet, like her wild counterpart, she is unpredictable, capable of sudden acts of violence when the natural balance demands it. In the myth of Iphigenia, Artemis demands a life be sacrificed, and a young girl's fate is sealed to secure the winds for the Greeks to sail to Troy. This myth, tragic as it is, highlights Artemis' duality. She is both the protector and the punisher. She offers care and guidance, but she also takes away life without hesitation when it serves a higher purpose. Artemis' role as the goddess of the wild is reflected in her weaponry, her bow and arrow, symbols of her readiness to both defend and to destroy. These arrows are not just for hunting animals, they represent her command over the wilderness, her power to control the untamed lands that she rules. She stands ready to protect her domain, and just as quickly, she will bring death if the balance of nature is disrupted. Her wild realm is unpredictable, and as its ruler, Artemis must maintain that chaos, ensuring that nothing grows too comfortable in the land of untamed creatures. The danger is ever present, but so too is the protection she offers to those worthy of her favor. Now we turn our gaze to Medusa, the fierce protector of Artemis' temple. The Gorgons, like Medusa, were creatures straddling two worlds, born of the sea, yet living on land, guarding the borders of the known world. Hesiod's account places them beyond the Hesperides, a place so far removed from civilization that it might as well have been the edge of the earth. This place was the domain of the Gorgons, a fantastical realm filled with mystery and terror. The Gorgons were the guardians of this borderland, protecting the thresholds between the known world and the realms of the unknown. They were symbols of the wilderness beyond the reach of man, a realm that, like Artemis' world, was untamed and unyielding. Medusa's transformation from a beautiful woman to a monster is one of the most tragic and symbolic in Greek mythology. Once a priestess of Athena, Medusa was punished for the actions of Poseidon, who violated her. Athena, in her rage, transformed Medusa's beauty into a curse. Her hair turned to snakes, her gaze turned to stone. The transformation was not merely a punishment, it was a reflection of the chaotic and dangerous forces that Artemis herself embodied. The Gorgons, though monstrous, were not evil, they were protectors of the wilderness, guardians of the boundaries that separated the civilized from the uncivilized. Medusa's presence at Artemis' temple serves as a reminder of the balance between beauty and danger, life and death, civilization and nature. Her monstrous form is not an aberration, it is a necessary force to maintain the natural order. As we delve into the myths of the Gorgons, we realize that they were not merely terrifying creatures but vital parts of the Greek mythological landscape. Their role as protectors of the wild is intertwined with Artemis' own dominion. The Gorgons were not just embodiments of fear, they were part of the very fabric of the natural world, guarding its most sacred boundaries. Their myth is a reflection of the delicate balance between creation and destruction, between the need to protect and the inevitability of death. The time in which these myths were born was one of extraordinary change. The Greek world was on the brink of a new era. City-states like Athens and Corinth were rising in power, and the Greeks were expanding their influence far beyond their borders. The Archaic period was marked by a tremendous outpouring of intellectual and artistic creativity, which led to the creation of the first Greek stone temples, like the one dedicated to Artemis in Corfu. This period also saw the emergence of the Greek alphabet and the growth of Greek culture across the Mediterranean. The Doric columns of the temple in Corfu, simple and unadorned, reflect the austerity and elegance of the time. These columns grew straight out of the ground like tree trunks, unembellished, yet strong. They were a symbol of the Greek ideals of balance and proportion. The temple, though small in size, was built during a period of great intellectual upheaval. This was a time when Greek thought was evolving, when the myths of gods like Artemis and Medusa were being preserved in writing for the first time. These stories, and the temples built in their honor, were a testament to the Greeks' growing understanding of the world and their place in it. The intellectual and artistic achievements of the Greeks during this time were profound. Literature, philosophy, and architecture all flourished. The stories of the gods were no longer just oral traditions passed down through generations. They were written down and preserved for posterity. The gods, including Artemis and the Gorgons, became part of a larger narrative, a narrative that sought to understand the forces of nature, the gods' roles in the world, and the balance between life and death. The evolution of the Greek pantheon, as depicted in Theogony, marks a pivotal moment in the development of the divine order. Hesiod, in his telling, doesn't merely recount the rise of the Olympian gods from the ashes of the Titans. He presents a sweeping narrative of change, where the new gods overthrow the older, chaotic Titans in an attempt to establish a lasting, harmonious divine order. The fascinating thing here is that Hesiod doesn't restrict his focus to the local myths or the deities that were part of the immediate Greek world. Instead, he reaches out into the vast, distant corners of the Mediterranean, bringing us stories of beings like the Gorgons, who were positioned on the farthest edges of known geography. Why did he choose to include them? Why venture so far west, when there were plenty of local myths closer to home? Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Hesiod's Theogony is this very act of inclusion. Instead of focusing solely on myths that were local to his region, myths rooted in the familiar lands of Boeotia, Hesiod ventured beyond the borders of the Greek mainland. He could have easily told tales of more familiar, nearby figures, nymphs from the woods of Boeotia or the Muses who resided on Mount Helicon, a peak not far from where he himself lived. But no, he chose to recount stories that stretched his imagination, telling us about the Gorgons, creatures that resided in the farthest reaches of Greek geography. Hesiod had not personally traveled to these places. His life was confined mostly to the Greek mainland, with a brief venture across the strait. Yet, in his works, he became the receptacle for all these myths and stories that were brought back from the expanding Greek colonies. During this period of Greek exploration, as they set sail to establish cities across the Mediterranean, Hesiod's Theogony became a vessel for these far-flung tales, creating a map of not only time but also space. The inclusion of distant creatures like the Gorgons, placed just beyond the western edge of the known world, allowed Hesiod to establish a cultural and geographical framework. The Gorgons were not merely monsters, they were symbols of the farthest points of Greek influence. By mentioning them, Hesiod was mapping out the extent of Greek knowledge and dominion, as well as solidifying a sense of Greek identity that reached beyond the immediate world and into the mysterious, unexplored territories. In this context, the Gorgons served as markers on this map, anchoring the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean in the Greek imagination. The Gorgons, with their horrific appearance and fearsome presence, weren't just mythical figures, they were part of a geographical storytelling, helping Greeks understand where they came from and where they were heading. They were part of a larger narrative of expansion, an effort to chart and connect the world in ways that reflected both the power and the mystery of the Greek worldview. As we look at the depictions of the Gorgons, we see a fascinating transformation over time, mirroring not only the changes in Greek artistic styles but also shifts in cultural attitudes. In the Archaeological Museum in Corfu, We find two distinct versions of Gorgon heads, one from the Archaic period, around the second half of the 6th century BC, and one from the later 4th century BC. The earlier version is more monstrous, bulging eyes, protruding tongue, and a wide, threatening mouth. This Gorgon was a creature capable of making an enormous noise, a visual manifestation of terror and ferocity. The snakes, while not present in this particular head, were implied by her disheveled, wild hair, hinting at the animalistic, chaotic nature that the Gorgon represented. But then, the shift becomes apparent as we move to the 4th century depiction of the Gorgon. The teeth are gone, and her mouth appears more controlled and less grotesque. Her appearance becomes more subdued, and a sense of beauty begins to creep into her features. The snakes, which once dominated the earlier version, are now less prevalent, with only a few slithering around her hair. This transformation reflects a broader trend in Greek art, where female monsters like the Gorgons and Sirens were becoming less terrifying and more beautiful. Over time, these creatures morphed into more alluring figures, maintaining their dangerous undertones but also embodying a beauty that drew in the observer. This evolution demonstrates the Greek capacity to blend fear with fascination, danger with allure. Yet, the core of the Gorgon myth remains deeply connected to the natural world, embodying fears of the unknown and untamed forces. Snakes, while not deadly in every culture, were very much feared in ancient Greece. Stories of tragic deaths from snake bites, like that of the hero Asclepius or the unfortunate fate of Philoctetes, were common and added to the Gorgon's terrifying reputation. Likewise, the tusks of wild boars, often seen in Gorgon depictions, linked the Gorgon to the animal kingdom, reminding viewers of the untamed wilderness where nature's fiercest creatures roamed. The wide, gaping mouths could evoke thunderstorms and other natural disasters, things that, in ancient Greece, were terrifying events with the potential to destroy villages and change lives in an instant. Interestingly, the Gorgons weren't only fearsome, they were also protective. Many of the Gorgon heads were used as apotropaic symbols, placed on shields or doorways to ward off evil. The image of the Gorgon, in all its monstrous beauty, was seen as a talisman, a guardian against malevolent forces. This duality, simultaneously terrifying and protective, speaks to the complex relationship the Greeks had with their myths. These creatures weren't merely threats to be avoided, they were necessary forces that guarded boundaries, both physical and metaphysical. As we continue the story of Medusa and her tragic fate, we are drawn into the myth that brings together two of the most famous Olympian gods, Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Poseidon's involvement with Medusa, while controversial, sets the stage for the Gorgon's downfall. Medusa's transformation into a monster, her curse of turning men to stone with her gaze, becomes the ultimate punishment for her transgression. But the story of Medusa is not just a tale of punishment, it is a tragedy of transformation. The cruel result of a deity's wrath and a world where power, beauty, and danger collide in a single, fateful moment. The narrative surrounding Athena and Medusa is deeply entwined with the foundation of Athens itself. And the tale begins with something as simple, yet as profoundly symbolic, as the olive tree. Picture this: the sun shining through the leaves of tall olive trees in Corfu, their roots digging deep into the soil. This is not just an olive grove, but the very place where the fate of Athens was sealed. It was here, amidst these ancient trees, that the goddess Athena won the city of Athens, not through battle or bloodshed, but by offering the gift of the olive tree, a gift that would go on to shape not only the physical landscape of Athens but the very heart of its civilization. In contrast, Poseidon, the god of the sea, offered the Athenians a mighty ocean, brimming with potential but lacking the permanence and practicality of Athena's gift. The city chose the olive tree, and with that choice, Athena became their protector, a symbol of wisdom, strategy, and peace. But this wasn't the only contest between Athena and Poseidon. Their rivalry is far more personal and tragic than just a city's fate. At the core of their dispute lies Medusa, and her story is one of betrayal, power, and immense suffering. Poseidon, like many of the Greek gods, felt entitled to the bodies of mortals, believing that no woman, mortal or divine, should be able to refuse him. His choice of Medusa was not one of love or even affection, but of dominance. He raped her in the sacred temple of Athena, a transgression that, in the eyes of the gods, was unforgivable. But rather than punish Poseidon for his actions, Athena turned her wrath on Medusa, the victim. Athena's punishment was cruel. She transformed Medusa's once beautiful hair into venomous snakes. And with it, she condemned Medusa to a life of monstrous isolation. Medusa's transformation into a creature of horror and death was not simply a punishment. It was a reflection of the way in which society viewed and punished female victims. The idea that Medusa was transformed into a monster for something she had no control over is a tragic irony that speaks volumes about the treatment of women in ancient myths. Medusa's story is not one of a villain, but of a woman who became a symbol of suffering and survival in a world that cast her aside. Her gaze, which turned men to stone, was not born out of malice but out of the pain and rage that stemmed from a life of endless torment. The portrayal of Medusa over the centuries has shifted dramatically. From a victim to a villain, she has been recast in countless ways. In ancient Greece, there was little indication that Medusa killed anyone while she had agency over her own actions. Yet, as time passed, the narrative of Medusa's monstrous nature became more pronounced, distancing her from the complexities of her origins and reducing her to a simple figure of terror. Perhaps it is easier for modern minds to see her as a monster, a distant and evil entity, than to confront the painful reality of her transformation and the trauma that led her to such an existence. The story of Medusa takes a turn when Perseus, the son of Zeus and Danae, enters the picture. Perseus is an unlikely hero, born of royal blood yet cast aside by the cruel hand of fate. His grandfather, King Acrisius, terrified by a prophecy that his grandson would one day kill him, locked Perseus and his mother Danae in a chest and cast them into the sea. Yet, the gods intervened, and Perseus and his mother washed up on the island of Seriphos, where they were taken in by King Polydectes. Polydectes, struck by an obsession with Danae, decided that the best way to rid himself of Perseus was to send him on a near-impossible quest, to bring back the head of Medusa. Perseus, though young and inexperienced, was granted divine assistance. As the son of Zeus, he was given gifts by the gods to aid him on his mission. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, guided him with her advice and protection, while Hermes lent him winged sandals to travel with incredible speed. Perseus was also given a special rucksack, designed to carry the severed head of the Gorgon, and the cap of Hades, which granted him invisibility. With such divine aid, Perseus set out to find Medusa's lair, a place where she slept with her two sisters, Steno and Euryale. When Perseus finally arrived at the cave, he found Medusa sleeping, vulnerable, and alone. She was the only mortal Gorgon, the only one Perseus could kill, and he knew his mission could only end one way. Armed with his divine tools, he used his shield as a mirror to avoid looking directly at Medusa, and as she lay in her deep slumber, he decapitated her with one swift stroke. The blood-stained sickle fell upon her neck, severing the head that had once been the symbol of her curse. What happened next was extraordinary. From the blood that spilled from Medusa's neck, two children were born: Pegasus, the majestic winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden giant. These births were not the result of some miracle but the tragic aftermath of Poseidon's assault on Medusa. It is in this moment that the story of Medusa takes on a new dimension. Her death, though a heroic victory for Perseus, marks the beginning of something even greater: the continuation of her curse, her legacy, and the birth of two powerful figures who would go on to have their own stories. But there's more. The blood that fell from Medusa's neck onto the sands of Libya gave birth to all the serpents that would later infest the region. And thus the myth of Medusa's curse continued to shape the world in her wake. She was no longer just the monstrous figure to be slain, but a force of nature that left her mark upon the earth itself. In the next part of the story, I will explore how Medusa's image was reshaped through time, from ancient Rome to the Renaissance and into the 21st century. Medusa's story is far from over. She has never left us. She continues to resonate in art, literature, and popular culture, evolving with each passing era, but always carrying the same tragic core. Her myth is one of transformation, of a victim turned into a villain, and ultimately, a symbol of both terror and tragic beauty that transcends time. Medusa's myth takes on even deeper layers when we look at the properties of her blood and its profound effects on life itself. After her death, Athena collects 2 drops of Medusa's blood, one from the left side of her body, and one from the right. The drop from the left is lethal, a deadly poison, while the drop from the right has miraculous powers, capable of reviving someone from the dead. This duality in Medusa's blood embodies her complex nature, the potential for both destruction and salvation. A monster who could also save. In life, Medusa was portrayed as a horrifying creature, but in death, her severed head becomes a weapon of unimaginable power. Perseus, armed with her head, uses it to carry out a series of devastating acts. He defeats the sea monster, Cetus, turns Atlas into the mountain range that bears his name, and even petrifies an entire island of people who had angered him. At his own wedding, Perseus turns the guests to stone as a final act of vengeance. Medusa, the victim, who had killed no one in her life, becomes the instrument of death, a tool for Perseus's whims. This shift in Medusa's role from a victim to a mere object of destruction speaks to how mythological narratives evolve over time. Originally, Medusa was a tragic figure, but as her myth was retold, her image was distorted into that of a dangerous monster. The head, once the symbol of her victimization, becomes a trophy, an object of power to be wielded at will. Medusa's transformation from a tragic figure to an object of terror exemplifies the objectification of victims in society, her humanity lost to the power of her gaze. The myth of Medusa continued to evolve, and by the time we enter the classical period of Greek storytelling, new interpretations began to emerge. Professor Tim Whitmarsh explains that, during this time, the Greek myths were constantly being reshaped to reflect the changing values and concerns of society. As Greek society evolved, so too did the stories, which were reinterpreted and reimagined, often taking on new shapes that better suited the contemporary world. For example, Pindar, a poet of the classical period, offers a radically different take on Medusa's story. In his version, the focus shifts from the act of decapitation to the lamentation of Medusa's sisters, who mourn her death. This gives the story a more sympathetic tone, allowing for a deeper understanding of Medusa's pain and the collective grief of her family. By emphasizing the mourning of the Gorgons, Pindar opens up the possibility for a more nuanced interpretation of Medusa's myth, a version where the focus is not on her monstrosity, but on the sorrow that her death caused. Later Greek writers in the 4th century BC, as part of a rationalist tradition, sought to strip the myth of its supernatural elements. They tried to explain the myth in a more realistic manner, removing the gods and monsters and attributing Medusa's transformation to more earthly causes. In these versions, Perseus becomes less of a hero and more of a villain, a pirate who raids the land, stealing from Medusa, a stately queen, and ultimately decapitating her out of obsession with her beauty. This flip in perspective shifts the story from one of heroism to one of moral ambiguity, highlighting how Medusa's beauty, as much as her monstrosity, played a key role in her fate. As the myth of Medusa continued to evolve, so did the portrayal of her beauty. The duality of her appearance, the idea that she could be both hideous and stunning, was a central theme. This duality would continue to shape the way Medusa was viewed in the centuries to come. The version of Medusa's story that many are familiar with today is shaped in part by the works of later writers like Pseudo-Apollodorus, who compiled and codified Greek mythology. These later versions, emerging from a period of cultural reflection and synthesis, cemented Medusa's place as a canonical figure in the mythological tradition. Through these evolving narratives, Medusa became a symbol of the complexities of beauty, power, victimhood, and monstrosity, a figure whose story could never be fully understood without examining the many layers of her myth. As we explore the way Medusa's myth has evolved from the ancient world through to the Renaissance and beyond, it becomes clear that her story is not just one of horror and tragedy but also one of profound transformation. Medusa's legacy has remained a vital part of our cultural imagination, continuously reshaped and reinterpreted to reflect the values and anxieties of each era. From her origins as a tragic figure in the ancient myths to her current role as a symbol of empowerment and resistance, Medusa's story is one that never truly ends. It evolves with each retelling, always revealing new insights into the human experience. As Medusa's myth evolved, so did her representation in art and literature, transitioning from a terrifying monster to a tragic, almost sympathetic figure. The story of Medusa, though multifaceted, finds its most widely recognized form through the writings of Pseudo-Apollodorus, whose compilation of Greek myths cemented many of the canonical details of the Medusa tale. This version of her story, often referred to in modern adaptations like Clash of the Titans, focuses on Perseus as the heroic figure, emphasizing his triumph and victory over the Gorgon. However, as Professor Tim Widmarsh points out, this version of Perseus is not the universally heroic figure we see today. In fact, in some versions of the myth, Perseus is portrayed as a deeply flawed character, mean-spirited, vindictive, and misogynistic, completely at odds with his depiction in mainstream retellings. One such example comes from the poet Nonnus, whose epic portrays Perseus as a pirate, a marauder who wrongs Medusa. In Nonnus's account, Perseus is no hero. Instead, he is a thief who decapitates Medusa, driven by a misguided desire for her beauty and the power her head represents. This version emphasizes a darker, more moralistic view of Perseus, which contrasts sharply with the classical image of the hero. Medusa, in contrast, is stripped of her family, her Gorgon sisters, her sea monster parents, and even her children. Her isolation amplifies her role as a victim, and over time, this vulnerability transforms her into a more disposable character, someone who can be easily discarded. Both in the narrative and in the societal consciousness, this transformation into a solitary, expendable figure is reflected in various aspects of her story. As her myth evolves, Medusa is less a monstrous being and more a tragic character whose life and death represent the darker aspects of Greek society's treatment of women. Beyond the literary transformation, Medusa's image has been a constant presence in art and culture. She is a compelling and enduring symbol, her visage found in countless souvenir shops, particularly in Greece, where her head continues to captivate people in all its forms. In these representations, we see her transformation through history, from her fearsome, monstrous origins to more humanized portrayals. In fact, the gods involved in Medusa's story, from Poseidon, whose assault on Medusa sets the entire myth in motion, to Athena, who later uses Medusa's head as part of her armor, are also immortalized in these artworks. The Gorgon, in particular, is depicted in various ways. In early depictions, Medusa is portrayed as grotesque and terrifying, her mouth wide in a monstrous grimace, her eyes bulging, and snakes writhing in her hair. One such archaic image, seen in black figure vase paintings, shows Medusa with exaggerated animalistic features, wide mouth, tusks, and thickly muscled limbs, reinforcing her status as a creature to fear. However, as Greek art evolved, these features softened, and Medusa began to resemble a more human figure. Her mouth became smaller, her face less monstrous, reflecting the cultural shift towards making her story one of tragedy rather than terror. This transformation in Medusa's portrayal can be seen in the 4th century BCE, when her image started to reflect the more sophisticated and sympathetic view that emerged in Athens. One of the most beautiful and poignant depictions of Medusa comes from the mid-5th century BCE, where the artist shows Medusa in a defensive, almost childlike pose as Perseus decapitates her. This image is notable for its portrayal of Medusa as vulnerable and defenseless, like a child sleeping, rather than a monster. The change in her depiction marks the beginning of the beautification of Medusa, where she moves away from the monstrous to the more human and tragic. In many ways, the evolving portrayal of Medusa in art and literature reflects changing societal attitudes towards beauty, power, and victimhood. The earlier depictions of Medusa as a terrifying monster mirror the ancient Greek view of her as a dangerous figure, while the later, more sympathetic portrayals reflect a growing understanding of her as a tragic character, victimized by the gods and circumstances. This shift not only changed the way people viewed Medusa but also highlighted the complexities and nuances of her myth, transforming her from a mere object of fear into a symbol of the injustices faced by women, the consequences of divine abuse, and the enduring power of beauty and tragedy. Medusa's story continues to evolve as it is retold, offering endless possibilities for interpretation, From the heroic Perseus who slays the monster, to the tragic figure who loses everything, to the woman whose head becomes a weapon of mass destruction, Medusa's myth remains a reflection of human complexity, powerful, vulnerable, terrifying, and heartbreaking all at once. As Medusa's image has evolved through the centuries, she has gone from a terrifying, monstrous figure to a more sympathetic and tragic character, only to return again to her status as a symbol of fear and dread. The Renaissance, in particular, marked a revival of classical mythology, but with a new approach to understanding and portraying Medusa. One of the most striking shifts came in the way Medusa's image was transformed during this period. In early representations, her monstrous features were prominent. Her tusks, snaky hair, and exaggerated animalistic traits defined her as a figure to be feared. But by the Renaissance, these features were softened or removed, creating a version of Medusa that looked incredibly human, almost innocent. This transformation reflects the changing artistic and cultural attitudes towards mythological figures, with Medusa no longer solely viewed as a terrifying monster but as a more nuanced, complex character. The Renaissance artists brought new life and depth to Medusa's story. One of the most celebrated and disturbing depictions of Medusa comes from Peter Paul Rubens, whose work is filled with writhing snakes amid Medusa's hair, evoking a visceral reaction in the viewer. The intention behind this image is to elicit disgust and horror, emphasizing the monstrous and fatal nature of Medusa, but it also highlights the intense power and presence of the character. This portrayal remains one of the most unsettling representations of Medusa, capturing both the horror and fascination she has inspired over the centuries. However, not all Renaissance depictions were as terrifying. One such image comes from Benvenuto Cellini's 1550s sculpture of Perseus holding Medusa's decapitated head. This version of the myth showcases Perseus as a muscular, athletic young man, fearless in his hold of Medusa's head. The depiction of Medusa here is as a mere head, detached from any humanity. There's no sense of her as a character with depth, and the tragedy of her story, her transformation into a monster, her isolation from her sisters, and her eventual death, seems lost in the image. It's more about Perseus's triumph and less about the emotional weight of Medusa's fate. This artistic approach contrasts sharply with the more empathetic versions of Medusa that would emerge later, where her story was seen not just as one of monstrosity but as a tragic consequence of divine injustice. In a powerful contrast, Judith beheading Holofernes, a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, provides an alternative narrative of decapitation. In Gentileschi's painting, the act of beheading is not triumphant or celebratory but painful, brutal, and necessary. Judith is shown as hesitant, not enjoying the act, and clearly distressed by the violence she must commit to save her people. The raw emotion in the painting, the blood, the anguish in Judith's face, and the lack of any celebratory tone, serves to humanize her and shift the focus to the emotional cost of her actions. When compared to the portrayal of Perseus with Medusa's head, we see the difference in how the act of decapitation is handled, one as an act of heroism, the other as an ordeal filled with suffering. Fast forward to modern depictions of Medusa, and she remains one of the most iconic and enduring figures in popular culture. Her image is still being adapted and reinterpreted, keeping her myth alive and relevant in the contemporary world. Hollywood, for instance, has played a significant role in continuing to shape how we view Medusa. In the 1981 film Clash of the Titans, Medusa returns to her monstrous roots, but with a new twist. This version of her features a full snake body, and she is depicted as an isolated figure, separate from her Gorgon sisters. This portrayal makes her far more cinematic, drawing on her fearsome reputation rather than exploring her backstory or tragic circumstances. The Perseus of this film is much more heroic, undertaking a quest to retrieve Medusa's head in order to save the princess Andromeda from the Kraken, a sea monster that originates from Norse mythology. The movie adds an extra layer of drama by turning Medusa into a formidable obstacle in Perseus's heroic journey, emphasizing her as a monster to be defeated, rather than a tragic victim of the gods' cruelty. Medusa's presence in pop culture continues to captivate audiences, whether in films, literature, or art, and her myth adapts with the times. The ambiguity surrounding her nature, whether she is a victim or a villain, a monster or a tragic hero, keeps her relevant and open to reinterpretation. Each retelling brings new facets to her character, reflecting the shifting values and attitudes of the culture producing them. Ultimately, Medusa remains a timeless figure, a powerful symbol of both beauty and terror, vengeance and victimhood, whose story continues to evolve across centuries. Medusa's story is incredibly complex, with interpretations that evolve over time. In ancient Greek mythology, Medusa is often depicted as a monstrous figure with snakes for hair and the ability to turn anyone who gazes into her eyes to stone. But there's a deeper, more intricate narrative that surrounds her transformation from a beautiful woman to a terrifying monster. In the earliest representations, Medusa was not just an individual character but part of a larger mythological family. She was one of the three Gorgons, siblings who were born to the ancient sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. Medusa was initially described as a beautiful maiden, admired for her beauty and purity. However, according to the myth, her transformation into a monster occurred after Poseidon, the god of the sea, assaulted her in Athena's temple. In a fit of rage, Athena punished Medusa, turning her hair into snakes and making her appearance monstrous as a form of vengeance. This shift in Medusa's form highlights the power dynamics in Greek mythology, where the gods often enacted their whims without concern for the moral implications of their actions. This version of the myth portrays Medusa as a tragic figure, a victim of both Poseidon's violence and Athena's wrath. As time passed, the interpretation of Medusa's image shifted. Ancient Greek art often depicted her as a terrifying creature, but over time, the portrayal became more humanized. In the classical period, artists began to depict her less as a monster and more as a victim of her circumstances. This shift is visible in the change of her appearance in art, from the earlier depictions with animalistic features like tusks and an open, monstrous mouth, to the more human-like versions with softer features and a tragic demeanor. During the Renaissance, Medusa's story took on a new form in art. Artists like Caravaggio and later works, including sculptures by Benvenuto Cellini, portrayed Medusa not only as a fearsome figure but also as a symbol of beauty and tragedy. In these works, Medusa's decapitated head became a symbol of male power and triumph, though her expression often carried an underlying sense of sorrow and injustice. In contrast, modern depictions of Medusa have further complicated her image. As the myth became intertwined with feminist readings, Medusa began to be seen not as a mere monster, but as a symbol of resilience and empowerment. The image of Medusa has been reimagined, with some contemporary artists portraying her as a woman seeking justice for the wrongs done to her. A notable example of this is the 2008 sculpture by Luciano Garbati, which reversed the traditional image of Perseus holding Medusa's head. In Garbati's sculpture, Medusa holds Perseus's decapitated head, accompanied by the text, "Be thankful, we only want equality." In modern popular culture, Medusa remains an enduring symbol. She appears in films, books, and art, constantly evolving to reflect contemporary themes such as power, victimization, and vengeance. This adaptability is what has allowed Medusa to remain one of the most iconic figures in Greek mythology. Transcending her original role as a monstrous villain, Medusa's myth continues to be relevant because it raises important questions about justice, power, and transformation. Her story is not just one of a woman cursed into monstrosity but of a complex figure who embodies both victimhood and strength. Whether seen as a symbol of fear, beauty, or feminism, Medusa remains a figure who compels us to examine the ways in which stories and images can be reshaped over time to reflect changing societal values.